Jesus Christ. You know that blindness affects less than 1% of the population in our country? Did you know that? 1%. Less than 1%. And that's physical blindness. That's the inability to distinguish between light and dark. It's also legal blindness, which is, the inability to engage in normal activity, even if you're given corrective lenses. So, it's a blindness. God doesn't intend us to live like that. It's not God's intention that anyone would be blind. But that doesn't mean that blindness and blind people are bad people. People with blindness, they're not bad. As if to think that the blindness is caused by some kind of a personal sin. Not the case at all. Nonetheless, blindness is an evil. And it's an evil because it's a privation of a good that God intends. In other words, if you're blind, you're deprived of the good ability of sight, which is what God wants for all of us. And although, and again, blind people are not bad. People who's blind are not bad. Please don't read into what I'm saying there in any way, shape, or form in that regard. But it is an evil. And it's an evil that affects all of us to one degree or another, because to one degree or another, all of us are blind. We're missing out on stuff. We don't even know it. We don't know what we don't know. And God's plan is that we live in the light, that we can see, that we're free, that we're experience His goodness. And that's His promises, to bring us into the light. This was happening in that first reading from the book of the prophet Jeremiah. The people have been in bondage. They've been enslaved in Babylon. They're held captive, and they're in this darkness, this dark place. And God says, through the prophet Jeremiah, God says to them, the Lord has delivered His people. I will bring them back from the north. I will gather them from the ends of the world. With the blind and the lame in their midst, they shall return as an immense throng. This is indeed God's plan. God wants to bring us back into the light. He doesn't want us living in darkness and blindness. And He fulfills that promise through Jesus, His Son. Well, the Gospel of Mark doesn't really tell us, but I think it's fair to say that Bartimaeus was probably blind since birth. And if he was blind since birth, which he probably was, he wouldn't know what it means to see. He wouldn't have any concept of what that means and what it could possibly do for him. He didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't know what it was to live with sight. So for him to ask, Lord, I want to see, it's like, how does he know to do that? How does he know that he's missing this aspect of what God wants? And I really believe that the answer lies in the reality that every one of us is born for something more. There's always something more for us in this life. And ultimately, life here on earth is not all that there is. And deep down, every one of us knows that. There's this longing that we all have for something more. That longing, the word we use for that longing is hope. And hope is that confident expectation that God wants good for us, here and now. But not just here and now, God wants the ultimate good, which is life eternally with Him in heaven. In other words, God wants to bless us. He wants us to be free. He wants the best that we can have. He wants us to be the best version of ourselves. He wants us to thrive and prosper. He wants us to live in hope. Our problem? We're blind and don't know it. We don't know that there is something out there greater for us. We don't know that we're living in darkness. We don't know that we're missing out on God's blessing. And we don't know what we don't know. And the first step, of course, to receiving God's blessing is to acknowledge that. To restore hope is to acknowledge, I am blind and I need to be free. Look out, this is how Bartimaeus says it. Son of David, have pity on me. That's how he says it. And it's the blindness that can be more than just the inability to see physically or legally. It's the blindness that comes into our lives where that prevents us from living in hope. We miss out on that, and it prevents us from living the fullness of life that God intends for us to live. And that happens in all kinds of ways. Perhaps it has happened in your life or my life through trauma or hurt that might have happened in the past. And now you live believing that you must be on guard in order to prevent that trauma from happening again. Perhaps it was, you went to confession, you live your life, you go to confession, you're a good Catholic, and yet every time you go, you say the same things over and over again, as if you have no control over those things, so you say, what's the use? I'm never going to get over this. Perhaps it's that you've been given an insight in how to overcome a desperate situation, but that insight just doesn't seem to make sense. And again, why should I even try to do something like that? Perhaps it's simply that happiness is elusive, and life has become more or less a mundane pursuit of dull blandness. There's no conviction, no purpose in life. What's the use? What's the sense of it all? These are all consequences of sin. Again, like the blind man, not necessarily personal sin, but certainly original sin that the effects of which even baptism doesn't remove. And all too often, when we live in sin, we don't know what it's like not to live in sin. We think we're free. In fact, we've never really experienced true freedom. We don't know what it means to see, to have sight. And it's not until we admit that we're lacking something, I can't see, that we begin to realize, I need to see. I need to find sight. It's not until we realize that we're missing out on God's blessing that we begin to do something about it so that we can experience His blessing. And that's just what Jesus wants to do, bless us. But you and I have to recognize that we need blessings in our lives, and then to acknowledge the places in our lives where we can get those blessings, acknowledge those needs in our lives, and then we got to tell them. Jesus says to Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus never assumes to know what we need. He never assumes to know what we need. He never imposes Himself upon us, but He does give us the opportunity to be specific about our needs. And so Bartimaeus says, "Master, I want to see." That's God's plan. That's what God wants for you and me, for everyone, to live in the light, to be able to see, not to be blind. If that's God's plan, we have to admit to ourselves, we have to be honest with ourselves that there is another plan. If that's God's plan, we have to admit there's another plan, and the other plan is Satan's plan for our lives. You do know that Satan has a plan for your life. You know that, don't you? Yeah, Satan has a plan for your life. He does. He wants you to live in hopelessness. Satan wants you to live in bondage. Satan wants you to be tormented by the darkness, tormented by blindness, tormented by sin. That's what Satan wants for you. You know that story of the unforgiving servant? It's the story the king gathers he's calling in his markers. Calls all his servants and "You owe me this, you owe me that, pay up." And the one servant looks at "I can't pay this guy back. I have no way to pay this guy back." And he goes to the king and he says, "King, look, I want to pay you back, but I can't. Just give me time and I'll pay you back." And the king says, "Don't worry about it. Your debt is forgiven. You don't have to pay it back." And the servant goes away. He sees one of his fellow servants who owes him a little bit less, but still owes him. And he says, "Pay back what you owe me." And the servant says, "No, I can't. Give me time and I will." And he said, "No, I'm throwing you in jail till you pay back the last penny." You see, that first servant was given a great gift, and he didn't take it. He didn't receive it. He was given that gift of mercy, and he didn't take it. And that's why when he went to this other servant, he couldn't give the gift to him because he didn't have it to give. He only wanted to pay back the debt. And he saw this other servant as an opportunity to pay back the debt. But he couldn't pay it back. There was no way that he was going to pay it back. It was too immense of a debt. It's not until we're able to give mercy. It's not until we're unable, I should say it this way. Not only are we unable to give mercy we haven't received, we're unable to receive what we refuse to give. And so this guy couldn't give mercy because he hadn't received it, but he didn't want to give it, so he couldn't receive it. I don't want God's mercy in my life because that might mean I have to be merciful. I don't want God to forgive me because that means I have to forgive somebody else that I don't really want to forgive. And God can't free us. God can't bring us into the light if we prefer to live in the dark. Every blessing that God gives comes with a responsibility to use it. Now, I'll get into that more detail later in this series, but for now, the consequence of not receiving mercy and thus not being able to be merciful is a life of torment. You see, that's what happens when the king then says, I'm throwing you in jail until you pay back the last penny. You are going to be tormented until you recognize you can't pay it back and that you have to accept this gift that I'm giving to you. And Satan will torment us until we're ready to receive that gift and give it to others. And that torment can really become a source of doubt. I really don't believe that I can experience God's blessing in my life, let alone what is his blessing. We can't see how God can bless us. And so we have to say, what's the torment? What's preventing us from being blessed by God? How is Satan tormenting us? How is Satan tormenting you? How are you living in darkness? How are we living in darkness and sin? Now remember, just because of sin doesn't mean you're a bad person. Doesn't mean that. Because there's always room for mercy. God always wants to be merciful in our lives. It's always available. But we have to remember the torment is a reality that we all face. Maybe that torment does come from a trauma or hurt in life. And we do seek ways to protect ourselves, to feel safe, so we bury that darkness and never bury that trauma and never talk about it. I remember as a young teenager being deeply wounded, traumatized by another boy in my neighborhood. Now, it doesn't matter what that was and how that happened. What matters is that I've carried that wound with me ever since. And it wasn't until I recognized that's what's going on. That's the root of my sin. And then acknowledging what happened. And wow, the wound really finally can heal. And the sin quickly loses its grip on my life. It could be involvement with the occult, and you might think, well, that's a silly thing. You know, Ouija boards, fortune tellers, horoscopes, games like Minecraft. They're just games. It's just fun. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. Those things, what seems silly and like games, can really open us up to a kind of darkness and bondage that can be very difficult to get out of. the circumstances of birth. Now, none of us have any control over the circumstances of our birth, but there are some situations that really can have a very profound impact on our lives and how we approach life. For example, it's certainly not a child's fault that he or she was conceived outside of marriage, out of wedlock. But the sin of parents can really have a very profound effect on what the child might wonder and how the child might live his or her life, thinking, gee, if they're not that committed to each other, are they really committed to me? Then there's associations and environment. We tend to talk and act like those that we associate with. We react to the environments in which we live. If we associate with people who excessively drink, who use drugs, whose words are foul and vulgar, most likely we're going to be doing the same thing with our lives. We're going to be acting the same way. If our homes are a mess, it's very likely that our lives are as well, and vice versa. And then there's family sins. Those secrets that we don't really want anyone to know about, but really do profoundly affect how we live our lives. The kind of things like abuse, alcohol abuse, physical, emotional, even sexual abuse. They're secrets, and so the effect of those sins remain. There are just a few ways that we can be blind and consequently unable to receive God's blessing in our lives. And over the course of the weeks to come, I want to lay out for you what's necessary to receive that blessing that God really wants to give every one of us, and indeed what that blessing is, and what life can really be like when we live in his blessings. For this week, though, just take some time and reflect on blindness. How might you be blind? And what is it that you need to be freed from? Because blessings will happen when you surrender. Recognize that there's something bigger out there. There's someone bigger who has a plan for your life. And that plan is that every one of us live in the light, live in freedom, live in hope. And when we do seek and follow his plan, it's then that we begin to experience his great blessings in our lives.